This podcast is intended for a mature audience over 19 years of age and is provided on an educational and informational basis. Any material presented is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for professional medical advice or as an endorsement or medical claim by Pattison Media, Everything Podcast, or Ripco.pro.
Testing labs are all over the place. People are trying to send to 3 labs just to get the highest potency. And ultimately, a lot of us have to play that game.
On today's podcast, the THC Wars.
Cannabis producers are fighting for higher and higher THC content.
But all is not as it seems.
We found within our circle, we all get these same results.
We're asking how these bigger, higher THC numbers are even possible.
So we've tweaked it, we've played with it, like how is this being done? Because it's blown our minds as to A, why is it happening, but B, how are they doing it?
I'm talking to a cannabis producer about their side of the THC wars.
It was just something that was just exhausting to do, and it didn't make our job fun anymore.
And asking, what's the point?
Now we're in a place where all of these numbers in front of us, we have to act like we know something about what we want.
I'm Don Schaefer.
I'm Ross Rebliati. This is the Potcast.
And here's the Pot News with Jay Coburn.
Legal cannabis in California has been found to be contaminated with pesticides. A joint investigation by the LA Times and Weed Week found 25 of 42 samples, all bought in legal stores, had concentrations of pesticides either above the levels the state allows or at levels that exceed federal standards for tobacco. The findings appear to back up complaints that 2 private Californian cannabis testing labs have filed recently, reporting pesticides in products certified by other labs as safe. We'll be talking more about testing cannabis for contaminants and potency in this episode of the podcast. Keep listening for that. European cannabis startups are planning to take their stocks public in anticipation of looser cannabis regulations in the US and Germany. The Financial Times reports that Grow Group, a London-based medical cannabis distributor, is planning an initial public offering on the Nasdaq in the first quarter of 2025. They're just one of a number of companies preparing for IPOs, including Lisbon-based Somai Pharmaceuticals and Welford Medical in London. Germany decriminalized cannabis in April, and the US DEA is also looking to reclassify cannabis to recognize its medicinal uses. Blood samples from injured drivers in Canada now contain cannabis more often than alcohol. That's according to a study at the University of British Columbia, which found that cannabis was detected in 16.6% of blood samples taken across Canada, narrowly beating out alcohol, which is at 16%. However, in most cases, the study says, the detected level of cannabis was not high enough to indicate impairment and increase the risk of a crash. That's the Pot News. I'm Jay Coburn.
Canada didn't legalize cannabis just so we could get high without worrying about being arrested. We did it because regulated markets are supposed to be safer. You're supposed to know what's in your cannabis and why.
Take my own brand, Nagano Gold, for example. Samples of that have to be sent to a lab for testing, just like any other cannabis that gets sold in legal stores. We want to know how strong it is and prove that it's fit for human consumption.
So Ross gets a certificate of analysis stating Nagano Gold's clean bill of health and its THC and CBD content. So, how strong is it? You can see that THC and CBD content on the pack of your weed. Pay attention to the part that says total THC. That's the one that represents how much THC is in the cannabis once it's been heated. The higher that number, the stronger the cannabis.
You can do the math. 200 milligrams per gram means it's about 20% THC. 300 means 30%, and so on. But if you're a regular consumer like me, you might have noticed something. You might have noticed that number going up. When weed was first legalized, you were more likely to see 200 milligrams per gram, 20%. 30% stuff was rare. But now I see strains marketed at 30% and up all the time.
Cannabis getting stronger isn't a new phenomenon. data from the University of Mississippi shows that weed in the 70s was closer to 2%. A 2020 study found that average THC concentrations increased by 0.29% each year from 1970 to 2017.
So growers have been trying to make stronger weed for decades. But we at the Potcast also know something else is going on. We've been talking to people behind the scenes, and most of us are involved in the cannabis industry in one way or another. And something's not right.
It's true that weed is getting stronger, but is it really as strong as they say it is? Or are some cannabis producers finding ways to inflate their potency scores?
It's tough to be a cannabis producer right now, and with all the marketing regulations, there aren't many ways to distinguish yourself, but potency is one of them. You have to put your THC and CBD content on your label, so you might as well make use of it. Honestly though, it kind of drives me nuts. I just want to produce a decent smoke without getting involved in a THC arms race. It's going to do the job at 20% or at 30%. But testing is so important. We need to know that our weed is safe and how strong it is. So that's why we're covering it on the podcast today. We're going to talk to a lab owner later about the actual process of testing and to get an insider's view of the ever-increasing THC content on labels.
My name is Kayla Mann. I am the Chief Financial and Sales Officer at Cake and Caviar. We're a micro producer and processor in the Shuswap of BC, and we work in aquaponics, which is a little bit weird.
Kayla Mann works for both Cake and Caviar and their growing facility, Habitat.
Cannabis fits into my life as kind of the hug that I need sometimes. It's kind of been an ebb and flow throughout my life as far as usage goes, consumption goes. The biggest thing that I look to cannabis for is a big hug when I need it.
When she worked at a different company, Valens, Kayla was instrumental in setting up their own testing lab. But when you hear how Habitat grows cannabis, you'll understand why this company in particular would care about environmentally friendly, contaminant-free cannabis.
We grow organic coho salmon as well as cannabis in the same system. So we've built a technology that allows that symbiotic ecosystem to happen, and we're really just emulating nature to create two super awesome products.
That's so cool. I want to get my head around the process.
Yeah. So it all starts with the fish, which is in a recirculating aquaculture system. That recirculating aquaculture system is an inland fish farm. So it is a very clean system that we grow our salmon in. We actually have just built out a hatchery as well. So we're doing the genetics of the fish on site as well. But from that, we feed them with a beautiful organic feed. Then they poop. We collect that poop. We put that through a digester, and that toils and toils, and we get it to a product that has lots of nitrates, nitrites, and all that. And then from there, we'll start to dilute it into a nutrient solution that we feed directly to the plants. So it's a decoupled system as far as risk goes, but it's really minimal additions to it to get to that final product. So it's quite beautiful what we've built.
Right.
We do see that we get a lot more trichome development than when we're just using salts or normal nutrient solutions in our hydroponic system. So it's ultimately a superior product. It's made well, it's made responsibly, it's made sustainably, and we still have that craft quality to it.
I could talk to Kayla about Habitat and Cake and Caviar all day, but we'll save that for a later episode. The real reason she's on the show today is because she's in charge of making sure that their cannabis sells. That's not easy in a market that seems to be driven by ever higher THC content. But Kayla's not taking up arms in the THC wars.
As someone who's struggled with certain addictions my whole life, cannabis is a really important key portal to getting to a better place in myself. So for me as a provider of this product, being in this chase of THC percentages and trying to bust these ladies to their deepest trichome densities is not the way that I want to provide cannabis. And I don't think it's the way that it should be consumed. And I'm not saying the hype squads and the guys that are really trying to push the limits, that's great. But as a standard for the general consumer, I think it does us a huge disservice as to what her qualities are to provide as far as an interaction.
100%.
So that's definitely where my head is at. These testing labs are all over the place. People are trying to send to 3 labs just to get the highest potency and then send it off.
Right.
And ultimately, a lot of us have to play that game.
Why do you think some LPs are aiming for ever higher THC content in their cannabis?
I mean, you look back in the day, it was, okay, smell this, smoke this, let me know what you think. Now we're in a place where all of these numbers in front of us, we have to act like we know something about what we want, and we don't maybe know enough about secondary cannabinoids. We don't know enough about what terps we really like in our smoke. So a lot of people, the first thing that they're going to go to is that potency.
Right.
And I hate to compare anything to substances like alcohol and things like that, but it's like going into a store, as we all know, and trying to find the highest percentage spritzer or beer to get the job done. And I think that really comes down to the fact that we can't talk about cannabis the way that we want to, right?
Right.
We're limited by Health Canada. And it's funny that we're talking about this today because I was on a private call with Health Canada's policymakers yesterday, going over the changes that are coming in and learning a little bit more about what their plans are for those and how they're going to implement them. And that was my last question of the day. I was like, you're all about public health and safety. This is not just a public health and safety concern, but it's completely turning the beauty of cannabis into this, like, I'm the fastest game, right? So that was really interesting. But of course, to their point, it's really hard for us to try and incorporate lifestyle choices with this, medical claims with this. We can't tell people why a lower potency product is just as good, if not better, than a high potency, or it's irrelevant to a high potency.
Yeah, that's just it. I mean, I find personally, like, I've got a couple of strains out now that are 23%.
Yeah.
But the terps are like 4 to 5%. And I find like if you add that 23 and that 4% terp together in a blindfold test, you could tell them that it was 30 plus THC and they wouldn't doubt it for a second.
Totally.
So is there something to be said about the legal limitations around marketing cannabis and the difficulty of distinguishing a brand in ways other than just THC and CBD content?
Huge factor. And something that we're seeing in these amendments to the regulations, Ross, is that now they're proposing, and this is also something I spoke heavily in disagreement with, was now they want to be able to increase the size of your potency on packaging.
Really? So that's a part of the marketing that they're looking at?
Yeah. We're in a world where people are sober curious. So, frankly, take a risk. I feel like this is something worth taking a risk. So I say companies and providers of cannabis in the space, we're the ones that need to take that initiative. Not to something that's explosive and weird and provides false claims for people, but start talking about it in a way that emulates the energy of cannabis or what it can be for people.
100%.
And bring people in on what type of amelioration it could have for your life as a substitute to other things. I went paddleboarding last night, and I'm off the booze these days, and we shared a 10 milligram beverage. I'm not a big edible consumer. I can smoke all day, but for whatever reason, edibles intoxicate me beyond. But the beverage, having 5 milligrams and getting on my board and then watching the sunset go down as my emulsification's kicking in 15 minutes, like, what a beautiful way for somebody to consume.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways that this beautiful substance can create an experience for us, and I think it's up to us to try and start talking about it a little more.
Yeah, for sure. Nice work laying off the alcohol. I did that about 5 years ago and rely 100% on cannabis, and everything's been smooth sailing ever since. So do you find that higher THC strains always sell more?
Yes, they sell faster. Like, as soon as you put the potencies out and the terps, I was more excited about the terps that I put out the other day, but of course, because it went with a 28.9% strain, our waffle bites in Ontario, it's flying.
Yeah.
I say that, but then of course there's certain things, and this is the hard thing though, you're pheno hunting for something unique or pungent or something that draws people to it, and then that needs to catch on to the naked eye. And people need to know that, oh wow, you got to try this, it smells great or whatever, and that's our blueberry.
Yeah.
She's perfectly between 23 and 26, more so on the 23 side. And I luckily haven't had to struggle to try and push that one. But again, I think it's because of that unique and very strong nose on her that people really like. Obviously the effect too, but that's a great one to showcase that, and your strains as well, that this can be the exact experience you're looking for. We don't need to be chugging cannabis to get to where we need to go. No. That's really the opposite of what I want the experience to be for people. And for me, it's not something that I appreciate. I think the consumer, a lot of the time, they're looking to go out, share with people, And there is where I kind of see why people want the higher potency. If they're sharing something, they're getting the most bang for their buck, right?
Right.
And that's really where these infused pre-rolls have taken over the market. It's been really interesting to see how many people, now when I go to the beach, people are smoking infused pre-rolls. I'm like, damn. I was like, I didn't even know you smoked weed. And now we're here, you
got the infused can.
getting infused for the group. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, which is totally fine.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
But I think there's something to be said about us kind of leveling our experience to something that still relies on us to have that experience. And it's not all just cannabis doing the work.
If high THC strains always sell more, is there anything that you guys do at Habitat as far as growing?
No, we tried to play that game. We tried to push the girls. It felt really volatile. And we found that when we were really trying to up everything, especially in our system, you start getting some nutrient offsets that just aren't favorable. We're in a living system, and the plants are living in water. We all know when things go wrong in water, you've got a fraction of the time frame to fix it before it's a bigger issue with the plants than soil. So for us, we're testing water and leaf samples every week, and we just saw that there was some really heavy offsets happening. And I would have to have my grower come in to talk any further than that. I don't act like I know all of the science behind it, but
Sure.
but it was just something that was just exhausting to do, and it didn't make our job fun anymore.
Yeah.
So we've had to really push where our markets are. I've had to really push on the sales side, change up listings. We do pheno hunt and trying to bring new things in, and ultimately we're exporting.
Well, you guys know what you're doing. I mean, you guys can push the threshold of the plant to the point where it's supposed to get to.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, I think that's where it should stay.
Yeah.
So what's your sense of the accuracy of the THC content on cannabis labels across the market?
Completely wrong. Because we went into this, okay, well, maybe we need to play this game. Let's start sending to different labs. And then we would get a 9-point difference from 2 labs on the exact same sample, taken from the exact same representative sample, split into 2, sent. Like, how accurate can we get this to see how inaccurate, not inaccurate, but variable.
That's a huge swing.
Yeah.
You would think that there would be a standardized test for something that's federally regulated. So what does that mean for cannabis testing labs?
I think they need to all get in a room.
Yeah.
All of us, Ross, at all aspects of the supply chain. I think everybody's struggling to one extent, or have. But it's really hard to motivate people when they're in survival mode with an industry that has been really difficult to survive in. I think it's really difficult for people to make decisions that are community related over their own survival and their own success. We see labs doing what they need to do to survive.
Right.
So until it becomes a mandate, I think they're going to do what they have to do to be the lab of choice.
It's competitive out there. I mean, we're in a competitive industry.
There's over 129 lab licenses in Canada.
Wow.
Where are all these labs? Because we're all using one of 4 or 5. In the flower space, I can't speak for other products.
So do you think there's a disconnect between what consumers want and what LPs are producing when it comes to high THC content?
I think the consumers don't have a choice but to want what's there.
Good point.
And then just be really overwhelmed when they get into a store and just see 200 bags of different colors and need to make a decision. So my heart really lies in Health Canada opening up the ability to market and package things differently. We have maybe 5 to 10% of Canadians that actually know cannabis, right?
Right.
That don't need the better understanding in a store or the background information on things to know what they want. But for the rest of the 90-95%, they need to be taught. They need to be a little shamaned in a little bit. We need to be able to give those experiences to people and not just I wish I could just smoke weed with a ton of people.
Right.
And know where they were at with smoking and then provide them something that I think would be really cool for them. Low and slow, see how this feels, savor it, taste it, feel it.
Yeah.
And
enjoy it.
And then you can actually connect to properties of the plant that will provide you that experience. You talk about the Blue Dreams of the world and all of these fantastic strains that I think a lot of, especially entry-level smokers, love and appreciate and can trust, if you will, to the extent that you can with genetics. But finding those is really hard right now because we're all trying to rotate through phenos just to keep things on shelves. And The liquor boards tell us this isn't selling fast enough. We need something else. You're changing up the product SKUs. There's just a lot in the way of just being able to give people what they want.
So are we just stuck producing high THC cannabis and chasing ever higher numbers? Where does it end?
I think we all just have to band together because it's in the benefit of all parties. We don't need to stretch and intoxicate people that don't want to be intoxicated. We can give options and actually sell those at large, right? Like, It's not like you're not selling low THC cannabis. There's a market for all of it, but we really want to make sure that that obviously is not the key indicator on somebody buying pre-roll for that party or that barbecue or that whatever. Like,
well, Kayla, I think that those days are coming because
Yeah.
it's, all about people like you and our community that are banding together right now to make it happen. Thanks for taking the time with us today, Kayla. It's been great. I really appreciate your insight into everything, and say hi to Rudy for me, and I look
will.
forward to coming out there in the near future.
please do. We'll cook you up some beef and salmon
Oh yeah.
and smoke some good weed. Appreciate you.
That was Kayla Mann, Chief Financial and Sales Officer at Habitat and Cake and Caviar.
I want to focus on something Kayla said in our interview there.
We would get a 9-point difference from 2 labs on the exact same sample.
It's something of an open secret that you can do this with cannabis. It's called lab shopping.
My experience with it is it's a pretty big problem.
This is Sean Ripley. He's part of our podcast team.
Before all this happened, I was Vice President of Chemistry at Agate Laboratories, which is Canada's biggest lab. So I've got a long science pedigree and entrepreneurship, and I like cannabis.
Sean is also a certified QAP.
The quality assurance person does pretty much exactly as the name sounds. The person ensures the quality of cannabis products coming to the consumer are not going to pose a risk to that consumer.
So what do we mean by lab shopping?
It really is a practice of finding the lab that's going to give you the highest THC number. There's a couple of reasons why you'd want to do that, but that's generally what lab shopping is all about.
There's research to back up what Sean thinks too. Last year, a lab in BC called Supra Research and Development went out and bought 46 different flower products from stores and tested them for themselves. They found that every single one had lower THC results than what was on the packet. So in this part of the podcast, we're going to find out how that's even possible. Sean has a long history in labs. He was working with them long before cannabis was legalized. So he can compare cannabis testing to things like agriculture.
Especially, coming from the lab world myself. It's interesting to me that if we were testing environmental samples at Agate Laboratories, for example, we would test for contaminants in soil, for example. We had to be right because you're talking millions of dollars in cleanups and all that sort of thing. So Canadian regulators required labs to actually do performance testing. They'd send out a sample of soil to all the labs. They knew how much a particular compound was in that soil. They'd ask you to tell them how much. And if you were wrong, you're not doing any testing. And this happens in medical, happens all across different labs, but not in cannabis.
Like Sean says, labs aren't routinely compared to make sure they're all getting similar results. To be fair, consistency is a little difficult with something organic and varied like a cannabis plant. But there are some labs out there who are working to change that.
I'm Zach Paul. I'm the CEO and founder of Northern Scientific. We are a cannabis-focused analytical testing lab here in Langley, BC.
Zach will tell us how he's already changing the cannabis testing industry in Canada in a little bit. But first I wanted to find out what actually goes on in a cannabis testing facility.
It's a lot. We look for 96 different pesticides. So you need to prove there's no pesticides within it, or if there are, they're below the legal limit. We also look for aflatoxins, which are fungi that grow within tropical environments, which is conducive of cannabis environments. We also look at heavy metals. So cannabis, similar to hemp, they like to leach anything that's in those soils or in the nutrients. It really grabs onto everything. So we need to ensure that anybody growing in living soil, cocoa husks, outdoor grows, that it's not picking up any nasties. Lead, mercury, chromium is a new one we're looking at.
Sean Ripley actually told us that cannabis is so good at sucking up heavy metals, it can be used to treat contaminated soil.
Cannabis is a fantastic, and hemp is a fantastic plant for actually cleaning up metals out of soils. Yeah, if you have metal contaminated soil, you can use, mostly use hemp, to pull, say, cadmium or mercury out of the soil. So we have to watch, because cannabis will pull up those heavy metals, and we don't want to be inhaling heavy metals. It causes Alzheimer's and other mental issues.
So labs are key in stopping things like lead getting into our lungs.
Arsenic also, we've seen a couple hits on arsenic, which is indicative of anything grown in BC. It's ever present.
Arsenic is naturally occurring in soil in British Columbia, and we've got to make sure that it doesn't get into our cannabis.
It also goes through a full microbiology screening. So we have to look at total yeast and mold, which is a big issue to deal with. A lot of it is avoidable. Practice needs to be really tight. The denser the bud, the less the airflow, so the more conducive it's going to be to yeast and molds.
And then the part we're all excited about is testing how high these plants will get you.
A lot of people don't realize that the flower has THC as THCA usually, which gets converted as you smoke the product. So we have to make sure that we look at total THC so the person knows what they're going to experience.
That's the total THC number that appears on packaging that we mentioned before when we spoke to Kayla Mann.
So legally, for potency analysis, you need your total THC and you need your total CBD. So you're looking at your THCA, your delta 9. We have an equation that does the conversion because, one is not decarboxylated and one is. So you need to do the math to determine what the total THC is. And that's the bare minimum. We go above and beyond. Some groups test for 15 different cannabinoids, some test for 10, 11 to get your total cannabinoid count. So sometimes you'll see those on social media where a lab might report or advertise, or a group might report or advertise that they have a total cannabinoid of 34%. And they're just taking all those numbers together and they're putting it into one. And then that's the total presence of cannabinoids.
Those cannabinoids include things like CBG and CBN, which you might have seen popping up more often in edibles and drinks lately. Those are limited to 10 milligrams of THC per unit in Canada.
We're seeing a lot more of that in marketing and communication now because it gets you that bigger number. It's accurate. It's total cannabinoids. This is what we found and what we saw, and there it is.
I got to cut in here, Ross. So I'm assuming that means they're not testing every single gram that ends up in the shop.
No, in fact, the sample tends to get destroyed by testing, so you definitely don't send in your whole crop.
Well, it's the same principles as any scientific experiment. We have a batch or a lot, let's say, from the producer, and a randomized sample, depending on the batch and lot size, statistically does represent that product itself.
One thing that stood out to me as a grower, though, is that different parts of the plant are often different strengths.
We've done multiple studies analyzing colas compared to mids, compared to smalls, and consistently you do see a different potency density or a potency percentage. And that's just based on our understanding of plant growth. We've studied those in large batch numbers across multiple labs, and we're seeing statistically higher percentages in those larger, thicker buds than those mid-sized to smaller ones.
But that's part of the job of QAPs.
So the testing comes from the quality assurance personnel from the client or our partners, and they are highly trained individuals. They're highly experienced. They see the business through two lenses. They see it through an operational lens that, we need to hit X milestones to get these products out on time in order to hit quarterly targets, monthly targets. And they also see it through the quality assurance lens, which is their largest lens. And they include quality assurance procedures throughout the entirety of the process.
So doesn't that leave room for a QAP who is maybe a little stressed out at a cannabis company with really tight margins to be selective with their sampling and only send the larger, stronger buds for testing?
Well, we asked Zach about that, but he says he hasn't seen that at his lab.
We make inferences if we're ever asked, but typically they have their own practices and procedures, and we test the product that we're given. Yeah, of course, people can be selective and people can salt samples and that, but it's pretty obvious when those things happen. We haven't come across any of that in the last 2 years that we've been in operations.
But Zach has ideas of how that might happen.
You can also salt samples as well. So if you're utilizing a milling machine for your pre-rolls, that mechanical process knocks a lot of the keef out of the plant and those trichome heads, and you can reintegrate that into that milled flour, of course, because you removed it, put it back in. That's a no-brainer. There has been occasions where they, sprinkle more of that back into the sample specifically. I'm not saying anybody has done this, but I'm saying it is possible to do it.
Or an unusually high potency result could just come down to mistakes in the lab.
On the lab side, using expired standards, which is essentially the benchmark. So in your classic testing lineup, when you start your testing process, you'll test a blank to ensure that there's nothing registered. You'll test your standard, which is the baseline we test against, which you buy from a third party. And then you test your blank again to ensure that there is no cross-contamination. And then you doing those internal protocols, you've established it's validated, we're good, we can start today's run. And so if you're using an expired standard, that expired standard will yield a higher end result for those tested samples for whatever reason.
You don't need to totally understand the lab procedure Zach described there. The short version is, if a piece of the test is past its expiry date, it can skew the results. The truth is we don't really know how labs end up with different results, but they do. And that opens the door for lab shopping. And that leads to the THC wars. But Zach and his lab Northern Scientific are working to change that. They and a group of other labs are working to get the same results for the same cannabis at different labs.
We do proficiency testing for potency. So we work with 6 other trusted labs in Canada, as well as several universities. And we go through a third party called Proficiency Testing Canada, who produce proficiency tests for a bunch of different analysis techniques, as well as different industries. So they'll do a blind sampling. All our labs will do a circular study. We'll all get the same blind samples, and we'll all blindly report our findings. And so we found within our circle, we all get these same results.
In Ontario, the provincial buyer, the Ontario Cannabis Store, did announce they were starting their own temporary testing program earlier this year to try and verify the THC content on cannabis being sold there. It's important to mention that reps from Health Canada do come out and audit these labs and check that everything is safe. We're not trying to imply that they aren't doing their jobs. But Zach has other ideas to make testing better. One of them is ISO certification. That's an international standard. Lots of labs in Canada have it, but it's an expensive and lengthy process and not mandatory.
Clients should be asking their testing partners, are you ISO compliant? Are you ISO accredited? And then to ask the scope of that, because you can have an ISO certification, but for one method type or one service type. We have 9 different service tests that we offer at Northern Scientific. But if we applied for an ISO certification for our heavy metals, for example, our scope just covers that one test that we did. It doesn't cover everything. But we could then advertise that we are ISO accredited.
That ISO accreditation exists because we're not the first industry to have to do scientific testing. Far from it.
I think we need to draw from other industries on this. There was a big gold mining scandal back in the 80s. It was the Bre-X gold mining scandal, where the labs were kind of in cahoots with the big public gold mining companies. The gold mining company was putting in river gold into the mining samples. And as a laboratory, river gold is smooth and not jagged and sharp. It's completely different. It shows up in nuggets in larger concentrations than it does any ored gold. And so they were exposed for salting samples, massive scandal. A lot of these labs that were involved no longer exist today.
Personally, I'm not going to play the game. I'm not going to keep trying for ever higher THC, and I'm going to stick with the lab I know is going to give me an accurate potency result. I'm not even a big THC guy. For me, it's all about the terpenes, the juicy, flavorful compounds found in all plants, but especially cannabis. Yeah, I want to get high too, but I'm a daily smoker, and I'm even not smoking those 30% THC joints all the time. But I do understand why some producers feel the need to take part in the THC wars, and so does Zach.
With the potency game, I don't think there's anybody that's doing it with ill intention. I think it's just an unnecessary game that a lot of groups have to play. And labs are the ones that need to hold that standard. I understand the business incentives from our clients and processors and producers to survive. Like, the pressures are so high right now, and so many groups are falling by the wayside, and people just disregard that completely. And if it's something that is going to take to survive, then you can't really beat somebody up about that.
If you're listening and wondering how you're supposed to know what strains to buy when the label might not be accurate, I'd say, first of all, pay attention to the terpene content if it's listed. That'll give you an idea of the flavor, but more than anything, ask the bud tender. They know what they're doing.
They are really on the front lines of communicating and educating consumers if that consumer wants to listen or wants to be educated or wants more insight. It's really funny because you wouldn't go to the BCLDB here in British Columbia or the LCBO in Ontario. You don't walk in there and you say, hey, where's your corn grain ethanol? I don't want that high test moonshine. No one does that. Good bud tenders that we've seen here in BC, being in my market, they're highly educated and they want to know more and they love to communicate. And it's communicating an experience or what someone's looking for. And cannabis is so personal. It's so individualized. So you can respond to different terpenes than another person. And that's really where that experience comes into play. And I think that's what buyers need to be more concerned about is those, not even the terpene percentages, but what's present. That THC will give you that psychedelic experience. And the percentage of that will just be how intense and how long that experience will last. Whereas, that lower THC percentage and those higher terpene numbers, it'll be more of a euphoric experience. It can be more of a pain relief experience. We have natural health products that are infused with terpenes because of those reasons. So I think it's just a line of questioning that consumers need to be asking or bud tenders need to be sharing.
That was Zach Paul, CEO and founder of Northern Scientific. He was talking to our reporter, Jay Coburn.
You also heard from Sean Ripley, founder and CEO of Ripco Processing, certified QAP, and scientific advisor to a whole bunch of cannabis companies. The Potcast is an Everything Podcast production in partnership with Ripco.pro. The opinions expressed in this podcast are not necessarily the views of the podcast team or our partners. This show is intended for a 19-plus audience. Thanks to our host, Ross Rebliati, showrunner Karen Habashi, senior writer Jay Coburn, and sound design by John Massacre. I'm Don Schaefer. Thanks for listening to Potcast, another Everything Podcast production. Visit everythingpodcast.com, a division of Pattison Media. Subscribe wherever you get your podcast.